Picture this. You're cruising down the highway, maybe with the family windows down, sunshine, and you see it in the distance, this massive mountain, and carved into the side are these giant presidential faces.
Like Mount Rushmore.
Mount Rushmore, exactly.
Yeah.
It's an image we all recognize instantly. But I bet most of us haven't stopped to think about what it took to create this iconic landmark.
Yeah. It's a story that goes way beyond just, carving some faces into a mountain.
Oh, yeah.
It's a story of ambition, of artistry, and even some controversy woven right into this monument's history. And that's what we're going to do today.
Yeah, let's dive in. We've got some incredible sources for this deep dive. We're going all the way back to the first dynamite blast to the protests that would later challenge its meaning.
What really fascinates me is how Mount Rushmore is connected to so many different parts of American history. It's a reflection of our national identity, our struggles, and sometimes those overlooked perspectives of the people who were here long before those presidential faces were carved.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Our story starts back in 1925 with a sculptor named Gutzon Borglum.
Oh, yeah.
Now, this was a man with a vision as grand as the mountains themselves.
Borglum was already a well-known artist,
Yeah.
famous for his work on the Stone Mountain Confederate Memorial in Georgia. But he had this even bigger dream,
Well,
a tribute to American democracy, and he wanted it carved into the heart of the Black Hills.
And the South Dakota Historical Society, they weren't initially thinking of presidential figures.
No, not at all. Their first plan was to highlight figures from the Old West, like Lewis and Clark, Sacagawea, and even the Lakota leader, Crazy Horse.
Okay, interesting. But then Borglum steps in.
Yeah, Borglum really had a way of getting people on board with his ideas.
Yeah.
He convinced them to switch gears and focus on 4 American presidents: Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, and Theodore Roosevelt.
So how did he convince them? Did he just walk in and say, we're putting presidents on this mountain?
Well, maybe not that dramatically, but he was very persuasive. He imagined this grand monument that wouldn't just honor these presidents, but would really embody the spirit of American democracy and inspire future generations.
And the Black Hills seemed like the perfect place.
He actually spent days exploring the Black Hills with his son, just looking for the perfect spot for his vision.
And he landed on Mount Rushmore.
He did.
Now, a mountain that was already very important to the Lakota people, but we'll get into that perspective a little later.
Right.
Let's stick with Borglum's vision for now. He didn't just want to carve faces, right?
No, his initial plan was way more expansive. He wanted to sculpt the full figures of the presidents from head to waist,
Whoa!
standing tall against the mountainside. And get this, he also wanted to create a hall of records hidden inside the mountain.
A hall of records. What was that all about?
Borglum believed that Mount Rushmore should be more than just a visual spectacle. He wanted it to be a testament to American history and ideals. This hall of records was going to be a chamber carved right into the mountain. And inside, he'd put important documents like the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution.
Wow.
It was meant to be like a time capsule preserving these foundational texts for generations to come.
It's like he wanted to create this lasting legacy, a physical embodiment of American democracy. It's an incredible idea. But I imagine actually building this thing was a monumental task.
Oh, absolutely. Funding was a constant issue, especially during the Great Depression. Borglum's first estimate was $460,000.
That's a lot of money now.
Oh, yeah. A massive sum back then.
So how did he manage to get the money to make this happen?
It took a mix of private donations, political lobbying, and a little bit of showmanship.
Oh, showmanship.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Borglum was a resourceful guy. There's this great story about him dropping an invitation from an airplane to President Calvin Coolidge.
He dropped it from a plane.
He did. Coolidge was vacationing nearby, and Borglum wanted to get his attention.
Well, that's one way to do it.
It worked. Coolidge was really impressed with Borglum's vision, and he eventually agreed to give some federal funds to help get the project going.
So the money starts coming in, and then what? How did they actually start carving these massive faces into the mountain?
It all started with dynamite. On October 4th, 1927, the first blast echoed through the Black Hills, and that marked the beginning of this massive construction project.
Wow.
It would take 14 years. Workers were dangling from ropes, carefully placing dynamite charges to blast away tons and tons of granite.
It's mind-boggling to think about the scale of this operation. And this was all before the days of, laser-guided machinery and all that.
Exactly. It was a feat of human ingenuity and pure determination. They used dynamite drills, jackhammers to shape the mountain. And Borglum was a perfectionist.
I bet.
He oversaw every single detail, making sure his vision was coming to life exactly as he imagined it.
But how did he even translate his designs onto the mountain? Those faces are huge.
He used this system of points and measurements to transfer his small-scale models onto the mountainside.
Okay.
Imagine a giant grid projected onto the rock face. He used surveying equipment and a pointing machine to translate his designs.
So like a giant connect the dots, but with dynamite and jackhammers.
Pretty much.
It's amazing to think about the level of precision they were able to achieve with the technology they had back then.
Right.
So they blast away tons of rock, carefully shape the features, and then comes the big reveal.
Right. Each president's face was unveiled with a ton of fanfare, usually timed to coincide with some important historical anniversary.
Oh, I bet.
For example, Thomas Jefferson's face was unveiled in 1936 when President Franklin D. Roosevelt visited Mount Rushmore.
These unveilings must have been major events drawing crowds from all over.
Oh, yeah. They were carefully planned media events to bring in publicity and donations to keep the project moving forward.
So the monument was taking shape, attracting national attention. But as we'll soon find out, not everyone was celebrating.
That's where our story takes a turn. We've talked about Borglum's vision, the construction challenges, the political support, but there's another perspective we need to consider.
Right.
The perspective of the Lakota people, for whom the Black Hills weren't just a pretty place for a monument, but a sacred homeland.
And that's where we'll pick up in part 2 of our deep dive.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're back, and we've been talking about how Mount Rushmore was created, the vision behind it, the incredible engineering it took the sheer audacity of the whole thing. But as we hinted at, there's another side to the story, a perspective that adds a whole new layer of complexity.
Right. We can't forget about the Lakota people. For them, the Black Hills weren't just a scenic backdrop for a monument.
Right.
This was a place of deep spiritual significance.
The Black Hills were sacred ground to the Lakota. What can you tell us about the significance of this area?
Well, to really understand the Lakota perspective, you have to go back centuries to their creation stories.
Okay.
The Black Hills, known to them as Hisapa, are considered the heart of their homeland. Their creation stories originate here, and many of their spiritual beliefs and ceremonies are tied to specific sites within these hills.
So it wasn't just about, land ownership. It was a connection that went much deeper to their very identity as a people.
Exactly. For example, Bear Butte, a prominent landmark in the Black Hills, is a sacred site for the Lakota and other indigenous tribes.
Okay.
It's a place where they go for vision quests, ceremonies, and to connect with the spiritual world.
Interesting. And within the Black Hills, there's a particular formation that plays a key role in this story, right?
Yes, there are 6 granite peaks known to the Lakota as the 6 grandfathers, or Twujikashilashakpe in their language. These peaks were more than just geological formations to them. They were embodiments of their ancestors, spiritual beings who guided and protected their people.
And one of those peaks, the one that would become Mount Rushmore, had a special significance.
Exactly. The mountain that Borglum chose for his monument was to the Lakota the embodiment of the 6 grandfathers. It was a place of prayer, vision quests, ceremonies deeply connected to their spiritual beliefs and cultural practices.
So imagine this. From the Lakota perspective, this sacred site, this embodiment of their ancestors, is being transformed into a monument to the very people who had taken their land.
It was devastating to them. Carving Mount Rushmore wasn't just seen as an intrusion. It was a desecration of a sacred site, a physical reminder of the injustices they had suffered.
So this wasn't just about presidents and patriotism anymore. It was about the clash of cultures, the legacy of broken treaties, and the unresolved issues of land rights and sovereignty.
Absolutely. The carving of Mount Rushmore just added another layer of pain and resentment. It became a focus for their anger and frustration.
And this resentment, this sense of injustice, it simmered for decades before finally erupting in the 1970s.
Right. The 1970s saw this surge in Native American activism all across the country.
Yeah.
And Mount Rushmore became a powerful symbol for those seeking justice and recognition.
What form did these protests take? Was it mainly about raising awareness, or were there more direct actions?
There were marches, demonstrations, calls for the return of the Black Hills. But one of the most dramatic moments came in 1970 when a group of activists led by Russell Weens of the American Indian Movement, they actually occupied the monument.
They occupied Mount Rushmore.
They did. It was a daring and highly visible act of defiance.
Wow.
They climbed to the top, unfurled banners, and refused to come down.
That must have made headlines. What were their demands?
They were demanding the return of the Black Hills to the Lakota people and the recognition of their treaty rights. The occupation lasted for months, and it really brought national attention to their cause.
Wow.
Yeah.
So this wasn't just some symbolic protest. They were making very specific demands, challenging the whole idea of who had the right to control this land.
Exactly. The occupation of Mount Rushmore was a pivotal moment in the struggle for Native American rights. It forced the nation to have a conversation about the history of injustice towards indigenous peoples.
And these protests, they had a ripple effect that extended beyond Mount Rushmore, didn't they?
Oh, absolutely. They brought renewed attention to the issue of broken treaties and fueled the legal battle for the return of the Black Hills. And this eventually led to a landmark Supreme Court case, United States v. Sioux Nation of Indians in 1980.
Okay, and what was the outcome of that case?
The Supreme Court actually ruled in favor of the Lakota. They acknowledged that the Black Hills had been illegally seized and ordered the government to pay compensation.
That must have been a huge victory for the Lakota.
It was a major legal victory, yes, but it wasn't really what they wanted.
What do you mean?
The Lakota didn't want money. They wanted their land back. They saw the Black Hills as an integral part of their heritage and their identity, something that couldn't just be replaced with money. So they refused the financial settlement, which, by the way, with interest has grown to over $1 billion today.
So the Supreme Court acknowledged the injustice, but the core issue of land ownership remains unresolved.
The Black Hills issue is incredibly complex. It involves treaty rights, federal trust responsibilities, and Lakota's ongoing fight for self-determination. There are no easy answers. It's a situation where a monumental sculpture became a focal point for centuries of conflict and injustice.
So we've gone from Borglum's grand vision to the deafening roar of dynamite, to the cries for justice echoing from the top of Mount Rushmore. It's a journey that reveals just how much more there is to this monument than meets the eye. What does this all mean for us today as we grapple with this complex legacy?
That's the question we're going to explore in the final part of our deep dive.
So here we are, we've gone from these incredible heights of artistic ambition to the depths of historical injustice, and we've uncovered so many layers of meaning embedded in Mount Rushmore. But now, as we stand here in the 21st century, looking up at those 4 presidential faces etched in granite, I think we're left with some pretty big questions.
Yeah, definitely. Mount Rushmore isn't just a statue frozen in time, it's a living monument, a symbol whose meaning keeps changing as we learn more about our nation's history.
We started with Borglum's vision of honoring American democracy. We talked about the engineering feat that brought those faces to life. And then we heard the Lakota perspective, a perspective that challenges the very idea of the monument itself.
And that's what makes Mount Rushmore such a fascinating subject. It sparks these discussions about representation, about whose stories get told, and how we deal with the difficult parts of our past while still holding on to our ideals.
So where does that leave us? What does Mount Rushmore even represent in the 21st century? Is it still a symbol of American ideals, or has its meaning changed because of what we've learned?
I think it's both. It can be a symbol of American ambition, ingenuity, and the pursuit of democracy. But it can also be a symbol of broken promises, cultural insensitivity, and the displacement of indigenous peoples. It's not one or the other. It's both.
It sounds like we can't really talk about Mount Rushmore without acknowledging the Lakota perspective, that sense of loss and injustice that's woven into this monument.
You're absolutely right. Ignoring that perspective would be like telling only half the story. Mount Rushmore sits on land that was taken from the Lakota land they still consider sacred. That can't be erased, and it's something we have to think about when we try to understand what the monument really means.
So how do we even approach a monument like this with all its baggage and contradictions? Do we just forget about it, trying to change its meaning? Or do we just accept the complexity and use it as a way to start a conversation and understand each other better?
I think the answer is that last one. We need to embrace the complexity, acknowledge all the different sides of the story, and talk about the past honestly and respectfully. Erasing history or trying to make it seem better than it was doesn't help anyone. We can only learn and grow by facing the hard truths.
So Mount Rushmore becomes this kind of mirror, reflecting back at us all the complexities of our history, the good and the bad, the victories and the injustices.
That's a great way to put it. And it's not just about the past. These issues are still alive today. The Lakota struggle for recognition and the fight for indigenous rights are ongoing. Mount Rushmore can remind us of that and encourage us to learn more and get involved.
So what would you say to someone visiting Mount Rushmore for the first time? What advice would you give them to appreciate the monument and all its complexity?
I'd say go with an open mind and be ready to learn. Learn about the history, not just the official version, but also the Lakota perspective. Think about the symbolism, the art, the engineering, but also think about what it cost the broken promises, the unresolved issues that are still present. Let Mount Rushmore be a chance to learn to reflect and to engage with all the complicated parts of our shared history.
That's great advice. Mount Rushmore isn't just a tourist spot. It's a place where history, art, and culture all come together. It's a place that challenges us to face difficult truths and think critically about our nation's past and present.
Exactly. And when you're standing there looking up at those faces, remember the mountain itself has a story to tell, a story that goes much deeper than what you see on the surface. Listen to that story.
And if this deep dive has made you curious, keep exploring. Learn more about the Lakota people, their history, their culture, and their ongoing fight for justice. Read different perspectives on Mount Rushmore and the debates about what it means for our country.
Learning is a journey, and we're so glad you joined us for this part of it. We hope you've gained a new understanding of this iconic monument, one that goes beyond the surface and into the heart of what it truly represents.
And remember, this is just one deep dive into a vast ocean of knowledge. Subscribe to the deep dive for more explorations into the fascinating stories that shape our world. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, keep learning.